Welcome back to Pause and Respond, Episode 5. Over the last few episodes, we've been building something carefully. We talked about why reactions happen. We explored how the body signals what's happening before words or decisions even appear. And in the last episode, we began talking about honesty, not as a mode of self criticism, but as clarity. Today, I want to talk about what gets in the way of that honesty. Because even when you're paying attention, even when you're slowing down, even when you want to understand yourself better, there are still moments where something inside of you pulls away. You change the subject, you stay busy, you tell yourself you're fine, you move on before looking too closely. That's not failure, that's avoidance. And avoidance isn't a character flaw, it's a protective strategy. Today, we're going to look at why we avoid certain truths and what it quietly costs us when we do. When people hear the word avoidance, they often picture something obvious, ignoring a problem, refusing to talk about something, pretending that nothing is wrong. But most avoidance doesn't look like that. Most avoidance is quiet, automatic, even socially acceptable. It looks like staying productive, staying calm, staying agreeable, staying busy, staying focused on what needs to get done. In fact, a lot of avoidance gets praised. People are told they're strong for pushing through, maturing for not making things a big deal, responsible for keeping things moving. So when avoidance shows up, it rarely feels like dishonesty. It actually feels like coping. And that's important to understand because avoidance isn't usually about not wanting the truth. It's about not wanting the cost that truth once carried. For many people, slowing down enough to be honest used to come with consequences. Honesty might have led to conflict, maybe to rejection, to being misunderstood, to being told they were too much, too sensitive, or probably too needy. So the system learned something very practical. It's safer not to go there. That learning didn't happen conspicuously. It happened through experience, through moments where honesty felt risky and avoidance felt protective. This is why avoidance often shows up after awareness begins. You start noticing your body. You start slowing down reactions. You begin asking honest questions of yourself. And then something inside you pulls back. That pullback isn't resistance to growth, it's protection, responding to unfamiliar territory. So instead of pushing past avoidance, this episode invites you to try to understand it. Because what you avoid points directly to what matters. Avoidance shows you where the nervous system learned to brace. And once you see that, the internal work begins to change. Avoidance is not laziness. It's not denial. It's not a lack of courage. Avoidance is simply protection. It develops when the nervous system learns that certain experiences are too costly to continue to stay with. Not inconvenient, but costly. Costly in terms of being emotionally overwhelmed, maybe experiencing relational rupture, feelings of shame, exposure, possible feelings of loss of control. So the system adapts. It learns to move away from what hurts before it fully registers. That learning happens through repetition, not logic. Though moments where slowing down led to pain, where honesty led to backlash, where feeling deeply meant being alone with it. Over time, the system stops asking, is this true? It asks something more urgent. Is this safe? And if the answer is uncertain, avoidance just naturally steps in. Avoidance isn't a decision, it becomes a reflex at that point. It becomes a narrowing of attention, a redirection of energy, a subtle pull toward whatever keeps you functioning. That's why avoidance often looks reasonable. Right? You stay busy instead of overwhelmed. You stay agreeable instead of risking conflict. You stay logical instead of touching something a little bit tender. You stay calm instead of admitting that you're just not okay. From the outside, this appears to be maturity. Inside, parts of your experience are being postponed, and postponed feelings don't dissolve. They wait, they accumulate, they look for another way out. This is where reactions come in. See, reactions are often the body's way of expressing what avoidance has been holding back. Not because you're dramatic or you need attention, but because the system can only contain so much. So when someone says, I don't know why I reacted like that, often the truth is something important was avoided long before the reaction ever occurred. Avoidance protected you in the short term, but it charged interest. And that interest shows up as irritability, exhaustion, emotional distance, my favorite, resentment, and patterns that repeat without explanation. Avoidance doesn't mean that you don't care. It often means that you care deeply. So deeply that your system learned it was safer to stay one step removed than to risk being fully present inside of those feelings. However, the pause makes avoidance visible, not to confront it, but to understand it. And understanding it softens it. And that's where responding begins. Imagine someone who avoids conflict, not because they don't care, but because conflict just feels destabilizing to them. They stay agreeable, they keep things smooth, they tell themselves it's just not worth it. In the moment, this feels responsible, but over time, something builds. Resentment, fatigue, a sense of being unseen, because what isn't said doesn't disappear. It gets carried internally, and eventually it leaks out in tone, maybe in distance, and maybe in sudden anger that feels completely out of proportion for the situation that it's being released in. The reaction isn't about the present moment. It never is. It's about everything that was avoided before it. Avoidance kept the peace. However, it only did so temporarily. But it did so at the cost of honesty, of being clear with oneself and their environment to show what was truly going on in those moments. If what you heard steered something, pause here. Right? Not to analyze it, not to solve it, just notice where you landed. You might feel recognition, relief, maybe some resistance, right? That internal pull to move on. That's often avoidance showing up, not as a problem, but as protection. Instead of pushing past it, see if you can stay with it for a few breaths, not to confront it, just to acknowledge something here feels tender. That acknowledgement alone is honesty. And honesty softens what avoidance has been holding tight, thus keeping our emotions in check and not having to disproportionately release them to the environment that we're operating in. Now imagine someone who stays consistently busy. You know them, right? Always on the move. They're always productive. They're always reliable, always moving. From the outside, it looks like strength, like where do they find the energy? But inside, often it's just busyness doing a job. It prevents stillness. It prevents moments of reflection. It prevents feeling what hasn't been processed yet. And just because it hasn't been processed yet doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Right? Because slowing down might mean noticing that exhaustion, that sadness, that loneliness, or just overall dissatisfaction with life. So staying busy feels safer, but the cost eventually shows up. Right? We see it as burnout, emotional numbness, a sense of emptiness when things finally slow down and the lights go off and we put our head on the pillow and can't figure out why all these thoughts keep racing. Those are the thoughts that you held back with all of your busy work all day that weren't able to be processed. Laying there, avoidance here doesn't look like avoidance. Right? Running around all day, it looks like responsibility. But the body, right? Your body knows the difference between taking responsibility and being busy for busy's sake. Avoidance works. That's why people do it. It works at first. It reduces the discomfort. It keeps things stable. It helps get us through the day, right? But the cost is quiet, gradual. Avoidance doesn't usually create the crisis. It creates stagnation. You keep having the same arguments, the same frustrations, the same exhaustion, right? Nothing changes. Different situations, same internal experience. If you didn't feel appreciated doing the dishes, doing the laundry isn't going to make you feel appreciated either. If moving on to yard work after that and then cooking dinner, none of those are going to make you feel appreciated if you're doing them to avoid conflict in your house or at your place of business or whatever it is that you're engaging in that day. Right? The avoidance will keep you functional, but at the same time, it also keeps you stuck. It drains patience, it creates distance, and it erodes trust in self. And slowly, right, it sinks life. Right? Not dramatically, but incrementally. You stop taking risks. You stop having conversations that could actually change things. You settle, not by choice, but by default. And over time, that settling can turn into quiet grief. Not for what you lost, but for what you never allowed yourself to actually pursue or become. The pause simply asks a general question at this point. What am I paying to stay the same? Seeing the cost clearly is what makes change possible. This week, the practice isn't to confront avoidance. It's to notice it gently. Notice when you change the subject internally, when you stay busy, when I'm fine comes quickly. Pause and acknowledge. Say to yourself, this is a place I usually just move past. Saying that is enough. Awareness interrupts the loop. Once avoidance becomes visible, it becomes optional, at least over time. And that's how that pause begins to grow in your life and in your daily interactions and relationships. This week, notice where you move away, what feels harder to stay with, what avoidance gives you, and what it costs. You're not fixing anything. You're observing the trade-off. And that awareness creates space. Space creates choice. Avoidance isn't the opposite of honesty. It's often the doorway to it. Because what you avoid tells you where care is needed. The pause doesn't ask you to push past avoidance. It just simply asks you to notice it. And noticing is often the first act of honesty. If this episode resonates, the Pause and Respond book goes deeper into these patterns and offers structured exercises to help you move from avoidance into clarity at your own pace. You can learn more at pauseandrespond.com. Both the workbook and the book are now both posted and out. All right. But for now, let this podcast be enough. All right? Notice what you avoid. Pause with it. Let honesty arrive when it's ready. And remember, folks, less reactions equal more choices.